Hi, I'm Amanda Shoemaker, and today we're here with Dr. Mary Frances Berry, Charlayne Hunter-Gault, and Juan Williams. So this question's for all three of you. Do you think American news organizations sufficiently cover civil rights and social justice issues today? If not, in your opinion, what can they do better?
I want to answer first because they cover the issues.
Okay.
And I think that the coverage is not as extensive as it should be. It's not as in-depth. It's very superficial. And that it rarely makes the people who are listening or watching understand the intricacies involved in the issues. And I know that's hard to do in a short period of time. But I think that the coverage is superficial, it's sporadic. Occurs only when, somebody gets killed or something and it's sensational. And I think it could be much better.
Okay.
Well, I think that what's happened in American news media today is that you have organizations that are either liberal on the left or conservative on the right, and the people who are liberal only listen to the liberal stations, and the people who are conservative only listen to conservative stations. So you never have a really good dialogue. And I think that, there are some exceptions. I think the McNeil-era NewsHour, which is now the PBS NewsHour, still does a very good job at balancing, and they don't interrupt people, they let people speak, and so you get a clearer understanding of their views. But I think obviously we could all do a lot better, and I encourage people who are on the left and people who are on the right to try and listen to each other's voices, because I think that's what is missing in the cacophony of arguments and sounds that we hear coming out of the television, particularly television today.
Well, I just think if you look at it historically, we have a ton of coverage of race today. Historically, we had no coverage of race because of the cultural and political assumptions that attach to race in our society, and the people who control the news media being part of the class that saw no objection to slavery in the first place, and then to laws that allowed for legal segregation and even murder in the form of lynching. I mean, you couldn't even get the Congress to act on it, much less the news media in the mainstream to treat it as a serious news matter. If you look back as, recently as the 50s and 60s, the death of black people was not covered as even worthy of an obituary in some case, unless the person was, a white man's maid or a white man's chauffeur or something like that. And that was about his or her identity for the mainstream press. Then you come into a period where you start to see the big newspapers pick up coverage of racial issues, especially after the 1954 Brown decision. Suddenly, you get people who are civil rights on the civil rights beat, on the race beat in America, big American newspapers. And the civil rights movement itself, especially Dr. King, as he becomes the star, the personification of the movement, you see TV then shift to covering Dr. King, and where Dr. King goes is where the movement goes. And that becomes their understanding through the television lens of what it means to cover race in America. And then, of course, you have race riots in some of the big cities during the 60s. Again, an opportunity for the TV camera to say we're focused on race issues. Now, we've moved beyond that kind of coverage, but to reiterate something that Ms. Hunter-Gault just said, so what we have now is lots of coverage of it, but it tends to be coverage that's, I think, inflammatory, self-enforcing for people on the left or the right. And what you get in this situation is people cover race almost as a pop culture topic. What about the use of the N-word? Or somebody had a sensational trial. Somebody, this white man shot these black kids, but he was mad at their music. And then all of a sudden this very small case becomes large, and it seems to stand for something larger, and people pick sides. Do older white people identify with the man who was irritated at the blaring hip-hop music? Do the black kids identify with this grumpy old white man who then took out a gun and shot? And it becomes on that very simplistic level, I think, about race. But it's never, ever addressed in terms of the larger social issue. and the larger social issue, I think, is in this era tremendously missing the contribution or the importance, for example, of the growing Hispanic minority in the country, or the variations that you see coming in terms of the political conversation. I think it's very hard for lots of people with a black president to talk about some of the disadvantages that still are implicit in the society as a result of racial disadvantage, as opposed to saying, well, gee, what are you complaining about? So this is all, to me, part of, at times it seems like a frenzy of coverage. I don't think there's any shortage of coverage. The question is it coverage that actually illuminates, invites people to participate and speak out and to be constructive in their engagement?
Earlier you asked a group of students if we feel as if our generation is less active than generations before us. How would you guys answer this question?
Is this generation less active? Mm-hmm. Well, we don't have a civil rights movement, or we don't have a Vietnam War protest or a Free South Africa movement, but I think that young people are engaging. I find them engaging in a lot of different ways. I was just watching today Ronan Farrow's first appearance on television. I've known him for a number of years. He's been active. People like him have been involved in international affairs. They're in the Peace Corps. They're in the Teach for America. So you don't find people marching in the streets en masse as you did during the Civil Rights Movement. But I frankly think that young people, some we talked to today, were being a little hard on themselves, because I think it's too hard to generalize and say this generation isn't doing anything. I think they're involved in a lot of different things. It's not just always very visible as was the Civil Rights Movement. I hope that young people today don't sell themselves short, because they have a lot to offer. There are a lot of issues, and some of them aren't as visible as the Civil Rights Movement in the 60s was, or the Vietnam War protests, or Free South Africa.
And they've been in the Occupy movement, let's not forget that. And in New Orleans, where I am this semester, a lot of students are still coming down, trying to help in the recovery, which is ongoing there in all these years after the flooding with Katrina. So students aren't active in a, quote, civil rights movement. And many of them are active, as Charlayne said, in different ways. So while I would like them to be even more active, because I'm always wanting people to do more than they do, again, they shouldn't be too hard on themselves.
Yeah, I was at the University of Georgia, which is my alma mater, not long after Trayvon Martin was murdered. And I said, I've been seeing students demonstrating about Trayvon Martin all over the country. Where are the University of Georgia students? They said, they demonstrated last week. You weren't here then. So, when something grabs them as an injustice, or, as I said earlier, global warming and all these things, these young people are getting involved in these issues, and I'm happy to see that.
Yeah, I think one of the things that struck me about the conversation with the University of Miami students was they see themselves as apathetic, as opposed to my view of them, which is a privileged class of highly educated people who are well on their way towards leadership in our society. They have the tools, the support, and the question is, how do you use that in this modern context to achieve social progress, social change that will help us as a society become, someone else said, a more perfect union. And that is the challenge. But, the part of this, I think, is the flaw in our education and in our culture, because we look back at the heroes of yesteryear and we think they were perfect. They had no disagreements, and they all knew right from the start exactly what they were doing, and they didn't have any of the hesitations, insecurities, doubts. They didn't have parents nagging them about grades. They didn't have anybody worried about tuition. They didn't have anybody who didn't like them. And, all the black people were together. Oh, yeah, they all agreed on everything.
Right.
And so this is a fable. This is not history. History is of people who have doubts, insecurities, who find that they are divided by factions among their own supporters, and then somehow, with God's blessing or fate or however you want to perceive it, find a way because their values, their intent is to try to make a contribution to larger society. So I think that is, for me, the key focus, that, you know what, you may think you're just a student at Miami University, but in fact, you are a powerhouse, and you just need to tap into your power, sort of the power within, as you come into this new generation of social, political, and cultural challenges.
Do you have a question? Okay. You've all spent time in South Africa. What have you learned from Nelson Mandela, and how much of an impact has he had on your life?
Learned that Nelson was a freedom fighter, but he was also a warm, witty, loving man who could be a great friend. And so what I learned from him was how to be a freedom fighter and the importance of that. And he's symbolic for me of all freedom fighters. And so what I learned from him too is how much a human being can bear. It seems that there's a lot you can bear if you really try, and the cause is worth it.
I think that in some ways he and Martin Luther King were different, because Nelson Mandela was engaged ultimately because of the resistance of his government. He engaged in a violent attempt to overthrow the government, not to seize power, but to get them to come to realize that all people in that country were created equal. So they're different in that sense, because Martin Luther King was strictly nonviolent. But where they are so much alike as leaders is that they believed in judging people by the content of their character and not the color of their skin. So when Nelson Mandela when he came out of prison, from the very beginning, he talked about reconciliation in a country that the black people had been oppressed in the most vicious ways. And yet what he did, one of the first things he did was reach into the population of the oppressor, which were the Afrikaners, and pull someone into his close inner circle. And he continued to reach out to people who had abused his people and brutalized them and abused him for 27 years, and said, we have to live together. And that was Martin Luther King's message, and that's where the two are very similar. And I think that's the eternal, transcendent, transformative message of Nelson Mandela and Martin Luther King.
You know, I would just back that up. I mean, one of the things that strikes me about both King and Mandela is that, in some sense, they were princes of their societies. Dr. King's father obviously was a very well-known and powerful minister, a leader in the black community. And Nelson Mandela would have been a prince if he'd simply stayed in his tribal situation. But both had this larger vision. And again, this speaks to something we were talking about in answer to an earlier question you asked about young people. Mm-hmm. That as young people, they had to, I think, find their moment and find where they were challenged and where they would be confronted with their moment of bearing the cross, of moving forward despite the odds. In Mandela's case, and I find this something that sticks with me, you asked what I learned, something that sticks with me is the idea that, his parents didn't understand why he wanted to leave home. They didn't understand why he wanted to go to the big city, why he was interested in being a boxer or learning poetry or going to get a Western-style education, as they called it, or even why he would become a lawyer in a country with an apartheid legal system that allowed very little recognition of the rights and protections of people of color, and black people specifically. So he does these things, and he becomes involved with the African National Congress almost as a last resort, as a lawyer trying to get proper justice for his clients. It's not as if he's anxious to leap up and be this great leader or invented as that. And again, what you see is a young person coming into his own. And when he is faced with a challenge, not backing down, but stepping up. And, you could tell a similar story about Dr. King in his time. So what I learned from someone who goes on, I think, to make history and to be an agent of change for the better in society, revered by so many, is that these people found themselves and then went beyond what they thought was possible, and certainly what their parents or their friends thought they could do, surprise themselves, which is not a bad idea for us all, kind of surprise yourself.
All right, that's all the time we have. Thanks for coming.